Hello there, and welcome to Murder Most British. I'm Zach, the American.
And I'm Rachel, the awesome Brit. Don't laugh, it's not funny. I am.
You are.
I'm very awesome.
You're very awesome. You're not really into horror movies and scary movies and stuff, are you?
I don't mind as long as it's not them creepy ones where they're doing all that contortionist running at you sort of stuff. Like, oh, adorable. But yeah, no, that stuff freaks me out.
So you wouldn't think of like, when you're thinking of scary guys like Freddy Krueger or Michael Myers or Jason or, well, those are old ones, aren't they? I don't really watch the new ones.
No. When I think of horror movies, well, it definitely is not a cinema manager from North Wales.
Well, tonight's story is about a man who styled himself like he belonged in one of those films, only his violence was very real.
Peter Moore was his name, the man in black.
Yep. Well, he moved through North Wales in black leather, a figure half showman, half shadow. By day, a cinema owner. By night, he styled himself as something darker, the man in black, a figure who seemed lifted from the very horror films he adored.
Wales in the mid-1990s was still a place where the landscape set the rhythm of life. North Wales, in particular, stretched with long, exposed coast roads, towns clustered around harbours and chapels, and villages that ended abruptly at farmland or sea. Between these spaces were miles of nothing, darkness, wind, and silence once the pubs closed and the buses stopped running.
This was Peter Moore's world. He moved through it constantly, a tall, sharply dressed man with a precise manner and a habit of wearing black. He was best known as an owner of several small cinema chains dotted around the region. Old picture houses he had rescued and restored on minimal budgets. Locals recognized his silver hair, his immaculate clothes, and his pride in keeping the lights on when the multiplex era was swallowing the independent.
By the early 1990s, Moore operated 4 venues in Bugill, Denbigh, Holyhead, and Blaenau, and Blaenau Festiniog. Apologies if I pronounced that wrong.
I will say we apologize to the whole country of Wales. We are going to try our very, very best.
We're going to have to practice some, learning Welsh and...
Yeah. It's very interesting. It's a very cool language. I like hearing it. It's really, really cool. But we're not very good at it, and we are very sorry. But we will do our best, and hopefully you will give us some leeway on some of these pronunciations. Yeah. So anyways, get back to it.
Well, Moore, he showed mainstream titles by day and horror films late in the night. Moore often projected the films himself, served tickets, and even swept up afterwards. To patrons, he seemed efficient, slightly old-fashioned and eccentric, but harmless.
Horror cinema wasn't just a marketing tool for him. It was an identity. His offices and home were lined with posters and memorabilia. He dressed the part, black leather, dark shirts, and locals began calling him the man in black, which I like how he's like keeping these smaller cinemas going, and that is, I remember back when I growing up, they had the Strand Theater. They did movies and like plays and stuff. So it always seems so much more cozy and than to some big multiplex, Well,
yeah, and I mean, nowadays, a lot of over here, the cinemas just play films. Our local cinema does do theatre productions as well as movies, which is great that it's still, it's kind of like step back in time in doing both sort of production type styles. So yeah. Well, that persona created distance. People knew who he was, but little about him. He lived alone in a modest detached house at Kinmel Bay, neat and well kept, not far from the coast road that connected most of his cinemas. Neighbours described him as polite but self-contained, always driving somewhere late, always busy.
Moore's independence gave him freedom. His cinemas required constant maintenance. He traveled between them at odd hours, carrying tools and reels of film in the back of his own car. Those nocturnal habits meant no one thought twice when he was seen on the road after midnight. In a landscape where distance was routine, His movements drew no suspicion.
At the same time, his private life moved within quieter circles. Moore was gay, something he acknowledged only to those who already knew. In mid-1990s North Wales, openness still carried risk. Many men met discreetly in pubs, along promenades, or in known bars further east in Liverpool and Chester. Encounters relied on privacy and trust. His frequent late-night drives between cinemas gave him cover to visit those places without question.
Moore understood that world intimately. His travels took him through its spaces, late-night bars, seafront car parks, roads where strangers met briefly, then disappeared into the dark. His appearance, well-dressed, confident, articulate, gave him credibility that masked something colder underneath. Well, I think it's said that people had to hide who they were.
Yeah, be quite discreet with their
Yeah,
sexuality.
yeah, and it also put people at risk.
Mm,
Meeting strangers or whatever in dark places. That really put people at risk, and that's really unfortunate.
yeah. Well, by 1995, Moore was approaching 50. He had built an image of success from theatres that barely made money. Yet he carried a growing fascination with power, not just the power to entertain, but to frighten. Those who knew him professionally saw meticulousness and control. None could have imagined what that control would soon become.
Peter Moore had been drawn to the cinema from an early age. Born in 1946 in St. Helens in Lancashire, he grew up in a post-war world where picture houses were escape portals. He later trained in business administration, working first in office roles before moving into theatre management. By the late 1970s, he was living permanently in North Wales and beginning to buy or lease struggling cinemas one by one.
Moore built his identity around those aging buildings. He fixed projectors himself, mended torn seats, and spoke of keeping local entertainment alive. But the independents were fading. Television, video rental, and multiplexes were eroding profits. Moore's theatres survived partly through his thrift and partly through his reputation as a showman who could fill a small room. His attention to presentation, black suit, polished shoes, leather jacket, after hours, gave him an authority that bordered on theatrical.
He cultivated respectability, but there were glimpses of temper. Former staff later described him as controlling, easily angered, quick to humiliation if challenged. Customers saw only the surface charm. Those who worked for him saw the need to dominate every detail. Behind the smooth manners, he liked to be feared a little bit.
His evenings often ended in coastal pubs between Rhyl and Colwyn Bay. He drank sparingly, spoke easily to strangers, and seemed to enjoy the attention his appearance brought. He mixed business talk with film trivia, sometimes steering conversation towards darker material, horror icons, screen violence, how audiences loved to be shot.
That pattern, movement between towns, nights on the road, regular contact with strangers, would later prove critical. It meant he could approach victims without witnesses and vanishing before daylight. But in 1994 and 95, those movements looked unremarkable. The habits of a hardworking businessman keeping a fragile circuit alive.
Friends and acquaintances described his house in Kinmel Bay as neat to the point of obsession. Everything had its own place. Film posters lined the hallway, some framed, others tacked directly to the walls. A collection of knives and replica weapons hung in his study. Props, he said, from past displays and promotions. The effect was unsettling, but not overtly sinister. To visitors, it seemed another extension of his film fixation.
So now, as he's pushing 50, his isolation had deepened. His parents were dead, his social life was narrow, and his work consumed almost nearly every waking hour. The cinemas no longer turned a real profit, but closing them would have meant losing the identity he had built. Instead, he doubled down. The projectionist, the cleaner, the owner, the face at the front, the desk, always in black, always in control.
In early 1995, appeared prosperous enough. The light still came on in his theatres, and his business accounts were steady. But something in his private world was darkening. He spoke less about films and more about fear, how easily it could be created, how power lay in making others flinch. People around him thought it was just another of his dramatic streaks, part of the horror film persona he enjoyed playing.
That year, North Wales felt safe in its quiet way. Small towns, familiar pubs, roads that emptied after midnight. In September, when the killings began, there was no warning that a man from that same world, well known, well dressed, and apparently ordinary, was about to turn those dark roads and quiet houses into scenes of sudden, senseless violence.
Well, in late September 1995, the tourist season had long since emptied from Anglesey. The roads were quieter, hedgerows thick with autumn growth, and small villages drew their curtains early. In Caergaleog, a cluster of cottages stood just inland from the coast. One of them belonged to Henry Roberts, a 56-year-old retired railway worker who lived alone.
Roberts was the kind of man every village knew. Reliable, private, the neighbor who always nodded a greeting but kept to his own pace. He retired from the British Rail and spent much of his time tending to the garden that bordered his cottage. He walked the same route to the shop each day, bought small groceries, and returned by evening to listen to the radio with a cup of tea cooling beside him. That sounds really nice.
Love a cup of tea.
Just hanging out, listening to the radio, and enjoying
Quite a relaxing bit of life after working.
Yeah. Sounds like it.
Yeah. That quiet routine was the rhythm of his life. It was also the reason nobody noticed anything strange when his lights stayed on late at night. His nearest neighbours lived far enough away that a shout or thud would have gone unheard through the wind.
At some point after dark, Peter Moore arrived. He had driven from Kinmel Bay across the bridge onto Anglesey, his black car an unremarkable sight on the A5. He dressed as always, all in black, the uniform that had earned him his nickname. When he reached the cottage, he knocked and was likely admitted without alarm.
What followed at the cottage was brutal and fast. Roberts was repeatedly stabbed at his home. His body was found outside in the yard. The confined space of the cottage magnified the violence. Furniture displaced, signs of struggle visible in every corner. There was no theft, no argument that neighbours recalled hearing. It was an unprovoked attack carried out with overwhelming force.
When Moore left, the scene fell silent again. Curtains still drawn, lights glowing faintly through the window. The wind covered the sound of the door closing, and by morning, the village was unchanged, unaware that one of its own had been murdered in the night.
The investigation that followed would later treat Roberts' death as an isolated tragedy. There was no evidence of burglary, no suggestion of motive. Only the scale of violence stood out, excessive, deliberate, and unexplained. Moore was already moving on.
On the 8th of October, 95, he was in Liverpool, visiting a gay bar on Stanley Street. There he met 28-year-old Edward Carthy from Birkenhead. Outgoing, sociable, known for crossing the Mersey to go out on weekends, the two men left the club together after closing, Moore offering him a lift. It was an ordinary exit, noticed by a few, but remembered later. He was never seen alive again. His body would be discovered weeks later, buried in Clocanog Forest near Ruthin in Denbighshire, more than 60 miles from where he'd last be seen. He had been stabbed repeatedly and covered with branches. Rain and forest debris had concealed the grave until searchers, following a missing persons line of inquiry, came across the disturbed soil.
The forest setting magnified the isolation of the crime. There were no houses, no light, no witnesses. The assault had been carried out with the same precision and excess force as the earlier killing. Once again, nothing was stolen. Two men now dead, both killed in darkness, both attacked with a knife. Yet at the time, no one connected them. Roberts was seen as a domestic victim and Carthy a missing person found far from home. The geography made the link seem impossible.
We've seen this before, where it's different places have, different geography, different police forces. They're not connected, like with the internet and stuff. This is the mid-90s, so they're not able to have any sort of connection or go, is there something going on between these two, or is they just isolated? There's no sort of police interaction.
Yeah, also, I think within the police's mindset, they wouldn't assume that every murder's going to be connected to one that's, been and happened miles away and different counties, towns, and etc. So, I think it takes a while for connections to be.
I think what I'm saying, like they're isolated stabbings, no motive really, no theft. You've got a few points of connection in each to where it might perk something up, but like I do agree, like you said, it's hard to say, oh well, these two murders are probably connected, but they did have similarities. That's all I was really.
Yeah, I mean, like what I was going to say is, they can kind of get a profile from this person's killed in this way. It's happened in. They kind of have like a profile of the suspect, thinking, well, they've done it in this way. This person's done it in this way.
I know what I can see where you're going.
My brain's not working.
It's fine. It's I see where like I was saying with the points, they have a few points that are connected that are the same that might, but at the time,
Yeah, do you know what I mean? Like we've helped them to be like, oh, well, this is the type of suspect we're looking for because, generally every case that they've dealt with, in this sort of similar circumstances has been like a loner or, types of behaviors from suspects that they can then think, right, well, we're looking for this type of person. So, yeah, help with the investigation.
yeah. Well, Moore's geography made it inevitable. His cinemas scattered across North Wales gave him reason to move between these places at all hours. The cottage in Caergaeliog, gosh, that's a good one. And sorry, and the forest near Ruthin were only different stops along roads he had knew by heart.
For someone that's like, we've never tried to speak Welsh, I think we're doing pretty well.
I hope so. I'm just waiting for a few Welsh people to get down there and start going, now.
Yeah,
No.
we do apologise. We will practice more.
I'll try.
But by November 1995, the pattern was in motion. Though no one yet recognised it, Peter Moore's life appeared unchanged, still running his cinemas, still driving late between towns, and still dressed all in black. Outwardly, there was nothing unusual about his movements.
On the night of the 29th of November, his route took him once again across Anglesey, this time to the roadworks near Mona. There, 49-year-old Keith Randalls, a traffic manager from Chester, was living in a small on-site caravan while overseeing a project along the A5. Randalls was practical, reliable, and content with the job's solitude. He spoke with colleagues that evening before turning in for the night.
One time before dawn, Moore approached the caravan. What followed mirrored his earlier attacks. Randalls was stabbed repeatedly inside his caravan, likely caught unawares as he rested. There were no signs of forced entry or robbery. The act was sudden, methodical, and devastatingly personal.
When the body was discovered, the site was quiet. The surrounding landscape was almost untouched. Just tire tracks, machinery, and the distant sound of traffic. It was another killing in darkness, committed against a man whose only vulnerability was isolation. There it is again.
Yeah, the location of his
Everybody's
caravan.
isolated.
Yeah.
First one, isolated in a cottage. Second one, drove him to an isolated location. And then this one, isolated in a caravan on a job site, away from other places that people could see. It's all very deliberate.
Yeah, it's like, he knew of these guys and that he knew that they were living alone and very not good.
Well, maybe on his travels, he was scouting these places out or scouting these people. It could have been, possibly he's like, oh, well, here's a guy that's living on his own in a cottage and drives past the work site and says, oh, this guy looks like he's staying in this caravan here all by himself.
Yeah.
He might have been scoping all this out on his travels and just like fantasizing about being that, horror figure.
I definitely feel like there was intent to seek out vulnerable people so that he could, commit these acts. For police, it was another solitary death with no apparent connection to the others. Randalls was from a different county, older, employed, with no links to the first two victims. But the pattern, knife, night, and excess, was already set. Peter Moore's final murder came less than 3 weeks later.
Yeah, it seems it's escalating, just slowly escalating in the murders. He keeps getting away with it, he thinks. Because on the night of the 18th of December, 95, Tony, or Anthony, but everybody called him Tony Davies, crematorium worker from Coleman Bay, finished his shift and headed for home. He was a family man, well liked and dependable, known for the consistency of his routine. That night, he spent time at a local pub, chatted with some of his friends. Then he drove east to the coast at Pensarn Beach near Abigail.
Pensarn was quiet that winter, a flat stretch of promenade where wind whipped off the Irish Sea and streetlights threw pale circles onto the sand. It was a place where people met privately, especially late at night.
At some point after Davies arrived, Moore appeared, dressed in all black again, calm and composed. He approached without raising alarm. What happened next followed the same rhythm as before: a sudden burst of violence, a knife used with precision and force. Davies was stabbed repeatedly. The attack ended quickly, without struggle.
Well, by morning, his body was found near his parked car on the promenade, close to the seafront. The location felt unreal in daylight, Christmas decorations still up in nearby houses, the beach cold and silent. It was just 1 week before Christmas.
Moore's victims had been ordinary men living normal lives, chosen not for who they were, but for the opportunity they presented. He moved through towns like a traveling showman, crossing miles of dark road to reach each scene. He styled himself as something beyond human, a figure of horror from the films he loved, now acting out his own.
Reminds me a little bit of the last case we covered. That dude was,
Obsessed.
yeah,
Yep.
obsessed with his gory
Vampires.
vampires and stuff.
In films, yeah.
Well, North Wales, usually measured in quiet towns and familiar landscapes, had become his stage. Cottages, caravans, forests and beaches. Each was turned for a few violent minutes into a set piece. When the act ended, silence returned, leaving nothing to connect the killings except the shadow of a man in black.
By the end of December of 95, that shadow stretched across 3 counties and 4 deaths. The man responsible still drove freely through the same roads, showing films in small theaters, shaking hands, taking tickets, living as he had always had in plain sight.
When Henry Roberts was found in the yard of his cottage at Caerllegog, the scene told its own story. The small living space bore the marks of a violent struggle, furniture displaced, belongings scattered, and blood streaked across the walls and floor. Nothing had been taken. Whoever had entered that night had come in with one purpose: to kill.
The neighbors hadn't heard a thing. The houses were so spaced apart, and the wind from the coast carried off any noise. Roberts had been known as a quiet, kind man. The retired worker who gardened, shopped locally, and kept to his own routine. The ferocity of the attack clashed with everything known about him. There was no theft in that, so it just really baffled him as to why. What's the motive?
Well, scenes of crime officers documented every inch of the cottage. They photographed overturned furniture, collected the fabric samples, and searched for fingerprints. It was methodical, but it yielded little. There was no clear suspect, no weapon found, and no sign of who had stepped into Robert's home that night. For several weeks, the killing stood alone, a violent but isolated event on an otherwise quiet island.
Then, in late October, the body of Edward Carthy was discovered deep in the Clochai Nog forest near Rothin. His disappearance from Liverpool had been treated as a missing persons case until search teams located the grave, a shallow pit covered with branches and leaves. Beneath it lay Carthy, stabbed repeatedly. The injuries showed the same deliberate intensity seen in the Anglesey murder.
Yeah, finding the body like that is definitely not just a accident or...
Yeah, stabbed and then hidden. So it wasn't like an act of, rage or passion. It's like, I killed this guy, now I got to drag him off into the woods and bury him. It was all deliberate and planned, probably.
Well, the setting offered little forensic help. Rain had washed away footprints and soft ground held no tire marks. Even the burial material, Forest debris and wet soil yielded no usable prints. The similarities were behavioural, not physical, but repeated stabbing, no robbing, and a level of force that spoke of fury rather than chance.
Witnesses came forward in Liverpool. They remembered Carthy leaving the bar on Stanley Street with a tall man in dark clothes. The description was too vague to act on immediately. No name, no car registration, but it became a small point of light in an otherwise dark pattern.
So he's met these people. He must have met all three of these people in the gay bars.
Well, no, some of them, like one of them had a family in that, I do believe.
Oh.
Yeah. Like
I mean, that would have been my go-to, my
he might have
first sort of,
he might have known them or met them before, or
yeah.
like if he stopped because he's traveling around, they're like stopping for gas in the car and
Yeah.
whatever it might. Oh, hey, how you doing? Blah blah
Yeah.
blah.
Or even just passing by someone in a shop, they get they're like, yeah, I like the look of him, he's going to be my next on my list. At the time, few connected a rural Welsh murder to a missing person from Merseyside. But in November, a third killing made the separation impossible to ignore.
So on the 29th of November 95, Keith Randalls was found in his on-site caravan killed, and that was near Mona on Anglesey. Like Roberts, he had been stabbed multiple times. There was no sign of struggle beyond the compact violence inside the caravan, but no evidence of forced entry and nothing stolen. I think possibly he didn't even lock the door to the caravan. Just left it open. Probably, yeah, he's probably on a big site.
Yeah.
Didn't really think that anybody is going to
Would go
come
sort of
messing
rolling
around.
down there, yeah. But also, he probably wouldn't want to touch anything, to be fair, and leave fingerprints and stuff. So, probably just kind of elbowed the door shut. There we go.
Well, he's probably wearing gloves. If he's the man in black, he's probably wearing black gloves.
Probably. Well, the similarities began to feel undeniable. The same region, the same weapon type, and the same ferocity, all against victims who appeared chosen for availability rather than connection.
So police began comparing all three of those cases. The distances were significant, but all could be crossed within hours by car. Whoever was responsible knew North Wales well and traveled easily between those towns.
The pattern would sharpen one final time in mid-December when the body of Tony Davis was found in Pensarn Beach near Abigail. Davis had been stabbed repeatedly and left close to his parked car. There was no sign of robbery, a detail the prosecution later highlighted to show that violence, not theft, was the motive. By then, investigators could no longer treat the murders as separate events. 4 men, 4 scenes. There were no thefts and no clear personal motive. What linked them was method, not motive, speed, precision, and a level of force that suggested familiarity with blades.
Oh, Peter's got all them knives in his collection. But as detectives began mapping the scenes, a picture formed. A single figure moving across the geography of North Wales, unseen yet constantly present, across from Anglesey to Denbighshire to the coast. By the close of 1995, the investigation's focus had shifted decisively. Whoever was responsible wasn't acting out of passion or gain, he was acting out of purpose and probably enjoying it. So, serial killer.
Well, yeah. I mean, if someone's killed once and then they do it again, they're clearly enjoying themselves, aren't they? Absolutely disgusting. By the final weeks of 1995, the 4 killings had transformed from local mysteries into a regional crisis. Each murder had been logged by a different police division, but the pattern of knife attacks committed at night without theft against men in isolated settings, it forced a joint review.
Good. Yeah. This is where I was waiting for them to all come together. So senior detectives from North Wales Police convened to compare files. They plotted the deaths on a map. Caergay Liog, Clo Nog, Forest, Mona, and Pensarn. The geography spanned 3 counties that could be driven in a single night. Whoever had moved between those points knew the terrain intimately, the back roads, the coastal roads, the isolated lanes, and all that where headlights were rare. Like I said, he knew where all these places were.
Yeah.
This
Not
is where I
very
could go.
built up areas, is it?
Yeah.
Well, witness statements began to take on new weight. The Liverpool account of a tall man in black leaving a club with Edward Carthy was now central. Combined with the known habits of the other victims, solitary, late, unguarded, It pointed towards someone confident approaching strangers in quiet places.
Yeah, and that's like his customer service. He's not afraid to talk to people or chat to people about stuff or whatever. But detectives began cross-referencing potential suspects with the geography. They looked for a man with a reason to travel widely at night, someone known to locals in multiple towns, and perhaps someone with an unusual fascination for violence. The search quickly led to Peter Moore.
I don't know whether within this case, because obviously I don't read through our transcripts and stuff. You do that, so I don't know any of what. This is the first time I'm listening to this as I'm reading it, like our listeners. With those locations, are there any connections to his cinemas? Is this why they've been led quite quickly to Peter Moore?
It was like close or nearby or something like that,
Yeah,
here and there. I mean, but they're dotted about, and when he travels around, he's
yeah,
going through these places.
yeah.
So
And then people were obviously going to recognise that, well, hang on a minute, this man's always in black. If you're looking for a man in black, you
yeah,
know.
but they're like he was able to have these opportunities because
Mm,
and they were dotted between where he was going between the cinemas,
yeah.
and then
That's why I
oh,
was questioning whether, they would have been able to link him as a possible suspect due to the locations of his cinemas and obviously witnesses saying about
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, not exactly,
No,
close enough to where it made a pattern, and where the
yeah,
police were like, "Hey, let's look at this
yeah.
guy."
Let's have a look at this guy, yeah. His venues dotted the same map that now defined the killings: the Guilt, Denby, Holyhead, and Blenau Festiniog. Sorry, guys. He often closed them late, driving home long after midnight. His lifestyle explained his presence across the same stretches of road.
Investigators placed him under discreet observation. They began tracing Moore's movements, building a picture of his nighttime routines from witness accounts and travel records.
Well, attention then turned to his home in Kinmel Bay. The search that followed revealed a space as curated as one of his cinemas. Black leather jackets hung neatly in the wardrobe. Several knives were found, some ornamental but others practical, all carefully stored.
So, like we said before, the walls were covered in memorabilia and film posters and all that, but individually, none of it proved guilt. But together, it echoed the same persona the killer seemed to inhabit: a man blending fiction with life, dressing like a villain and traveling by night.
Moore was brought in for questioning. At first, he was calm and evasive, claiming to have been working at his cinemas on the nights of the murders. He listed tasks and errands, some verifiable, others pretty vague. He admitted being in some of the same towns, but insisted it was just coincidence.
Over hours of interviews, his account began to fracture, as it usually does. But confronted with the timeline, he contradicted earlier statements, claiming to have met some of the victims but denying harm. Then, during one session, he said something that froze the room. Asked why the killings had occurred, Moore replied that they had been done for fun.
Honestly, not my sort of fun at all. The phrase was written verbatim into the transcript. It was not shouted or justified, just spoken plainly, as if he was describing a hobby. Investigators would later describe it as the moment where motive finally revealed itself. Not revenge, not gain, but pleasure.
It's like that because we watched the Ed Gein story, The Monster, where he's like, it's just his hobby.
Oh, God, yeah,
Making
that was crazy.
making nipple belts and skins. It's just his hobby,
That was a really good thing,
Oh.
though. What's that? Monsters on Netflix.
Yeah.
Such a good
Yeah.
series.
If you haven't seen it,
Highly recommend that.
this is very good. But the forensic, okay, let's get back to it after gushing over Ed Gein's story, which was gross. The forensic evidence was still limited, but the circumstantial web was complete. His routes matched the geography, his appearance fit witness descriptions, and his own words erased any doubt about intent.
By early 1996, Peter Moore was charged with 4 counts of murder. The case that had begun as scattered violence across North Wales was now unified by a single name and a single pattern.
So in custody, offered no remorse. His remarks that the killings were for fun became the clearest window into his motive. He talked about films and how horror had always fascinated him, the artistry of it, the control. To detectives, it was clear that he had made himself the star of his own creation, the Man in Black. Now, not on screen, but in life.
Well, the trial of Peter Moore opened in November 1996 at Mold Crown Court. He faced 4 counts of murder for Henry Roberts, Edward Carthy, Keith Randalls, and Anthony Davies, each charged as a separate act within a 3-month campaign of violence. The courtroom atmosphere was cold, procedural, and heavy with the scale of what the jury was being asked to consider. Not one killing, but a sequence stretching across the geography of North Wales.
Prosecution's case was built on convergence. The victims, they said, had come from different towns and backgrounds, but their deaths bore the same unmistakable hallmarks: repeated stabbings, scenes left undisturbed, and no theft or quarrel to explain them. Each case on its own might have stood a mystery. Together, they formed a pattern.
The first case presented was Henry Roberts, the retired railway worker. Jurors were shown photographs of his small cottage, the overturned furniture, blood across the walls, the signs of struggle that filled the small room. The image was of a peaceful life ruptured by sudden violence.
So then next came Edward Carthy. Witnesses from Liverpool described seeing him leave the gay bar with the tall man in black. Jurors heard medical testimony detailing the multiple stab wounds in Shallow Forest grave near Ruthin. The picture was of a victim lured from safety into isolation.
Then came Keith Randalls, the traffic manager from Chester. Prosecution showed photographs of his on-site caravan at Mona. The interior splashed with blood but otherwise intact. His wallet and keys were left in place, a detail repeated again and again to stress that robbery was never the point.
And finally, the court heard about Tony Davies, the crematorium worker from Coleman Bay. Witnesses described him leaving a local pub near closing time, walking towards his car in Pensarn Beach, and he was found the next morning with multiple stab wounds and with his possessions untouched.
Across these 4 scenes, the prosecution argued, lay one signature: violence inflicted without motive, at night, by someone who derived satisfaction from it.
Jurors were reminded of Moore's own words from his police interviews. When asked about the killings, he had called them acts of fun. The term, reproduced exactly from the transcript, was presented as the core of the case, a window into his intent.
Prosecutors also drew the court's attention to Moore's cultivated image. His black leather clothing, his collection of knives, and his fascination with horror films weren't presented as proof of guilt on their own, but as an expression of the mindset that animated his crimes. It was not theatre, they argued, but a personal mythology that had spilled into reality.
Prosecutors described the killings as deliberate and sadistic, acts carried out for fun. To the jury, it was shorthand for what they were seeing in detail: the deliberate transformation of a cinematic fantasy into a killing spree.
Well, the forensic evidence itself was thin. There was no usable fingerprints, and the DNA methods of the mid-1990s lacked today's precision. Instead, the Crown relied on accumulation, the similar wounds, the consistent method, the geographical logic, and Moore's own admissions. Each fragment, they said, might be circumstantial in isolation, but together they formed a single line that only one man could occupy.
For weeks, jurors heard witnesses, saw photographs, and listened to medical reports that charted the same pattern: solitary victims, savage force, the scenes of eerie calm afterwards. By the time the prosecution rested, the image of Moore as the Man in Black, the self-styled villain in his own film, had become more than metaphor. It had become the frame through which the entire case was seen.
When the prosecution rested, the defence began its effort to dismantle what they called a pattern of coincidences, mistaken for proof. Their task was to separate Peter Moore, the showman, to the eccentric cinema owner, the horror enthusiast, from Peter Moore, the murderer.
They accepted that he was unusual. He dressed in black, surrounded himself by horror memorabilia, and embraced his reputation as the Man in Black. But they argued eccentricity was not evidence of homicide. The image he presented to the world, they said, was a performance, exaggerated for effect, part of the same theatrical instinct that kept his cinemas alive.
Well, the defence also highlighted what the case lacked: There were no fingerprints linking Moore to the scenes, no DNA placed him at any of the killings, no murder weapon had been recovered. So, without physical proof, they said the prosecution's case relied too heavily on circumstance and reputation.
Well, I mean, they did have that admission of him saying, that was fun. It was for fun. That's pretty damning in itself. But they pointed to the gaps. Henry Roberts was an older man living alone in Anglesey. Edward Carthy had vanished from a night out in Liverpool. Keith Randalls was killed at a work caravan. Tony Davies near his car at a coastal lay-by. Different towns, different victims, different contexts. The only link, the defense argued, was the assumption that one man had moved invisibly among them.
Well, jurors were also reminded of Moore's police interviews, particularly the word he used, fun.
There it is.
His lawyers argued that the comment had been flippant, not literal, taken out of context by investigators eager for confession. Moore, they said, had mocked the questioning, treating it like another performance. He was a man who loved provocation, not a man admitting to murder.
Bullshit. He was enjoying it.
Yeah. You don't say that you done something for fun if you didn't do, when you're being questioned over murders. You're not going to sit there and say, yeah, I done it for fun.
He was relishing in it, probably. He was loving the attention and everything that brought with it. And he's like, yeah, it was all for fun. Yeah, playing the villain.
Yeah, he was probably just trying to sort of...
This defense is just...
I get with the whole, there wasn't like forensic evidence really, to be fair. So looking at it, the case looked quite weak in that sense.
Yeah. But once you piece everything together, it's just that that the way the police and the prosecution can put it together and say, this is the puzzle, this is how it's put together, and this is who did it.
Yeah. I mean, they would have obviously checked if there was any receipts that he had from locations that would match up timings and stuff. So, lack of evidence of him actually leaving DNA and stuff like that is...
Well, to reinforce this, the defense floated alternative explanations, separate, unrelated killers, or chance similarities between unconnected crimes. It was, they said, a tragedy of separate acts being drawn into one narrative because they appeared to fit.
Well, when the defense concluded, the judge gave the jury careful direction. They were told to weigh each charge individually, but to consider the larger structure that bound them together. The repetition of method, timing, and motive could not be dismissed as coincidence without reason.
So he reminded them that Moore's lifestyle, his late night driving, his cinema work scattered across the region, his solitary habits, placed him within reach of each scene. The question was not whether he could have been there, but whether anyone else could have traveled the same path in the same narrow window of time.
After weeks of testimony, the jury retired. Their deliberation was brief, only about an hour. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict. Guilty on all four counts of murder. Moore remained expressionless as the words were read out.
That was quicker than Buck Ruxton. That was 90 minutes for him.
Yeah, 1 hour is pretty quick. I mean, especially considering there wasn't actually a lot of evidence.
Yeah, it was a lot of what they would say circumstantial evidence that piled together, but nothing that was like you didn't have a murder weapon, you didn't have DNA, you didn't have fingerprints, you didn't have all this stuff, but you had all this big wide net of all this circumstantial evidence that really painted a picture. So, and the jury was like, "Yep, that's that." So then the judge, Mr. Justice Maurice Kay, then passed sentence. The judge said the killings formed a campaign of murder of exceptional seriousness, deliberate acts committed for pleasure rather than gain. The judge said that Moore would spend the rest of his life in prison. It was, in effect, a whole life tariff, no possibility of release.
In his sentencing remarks, the judge described the killings of acts of wickedness beyond belief, saying Moore had preyed upon men who posed you no threat and offered you no cause. He noted that Moore's description of the murders as fun revealed a chilling absence of empathy.
Courtroom was silent. The families of the victims sat together, some crying quietly, others staring ahead. After months of confusion and fear, the verdict brought closure, but not comfort.
Well, Moore was led away to begin his sentence at Wakefield Prison, which housed some of Britain's most dangerous inmates. Reporters outside the court called him Wales's worst serial killer, a phrase that echoed across national headlines by nightfall.
Trial had taken over just 3 weeks. It ended with a simple truth laid bare. 4 men had been murdered for no reason beyond one man's desire to play out a role he had invented. The performance had ended where all theater does, under bright lights, with the audience watching in silence.
In the months after Peter Moore's conviction, North Wales was left to make sense of what had happened. Each killing had scarred a different part of the region: Anglesey, Denbighshire, and the North Wales coast around Penzance, with one victim, Keith Randalls, commuting from Chester. The towns had little in common before, yet now they were bound by grief. Tributes were held quietly in churches and community halls, gatherings marked not by spectacle but by resolve.
Obviously, the national press, they branded Moore as the man in black, echoing the theatrical persona he had built. But in the towns where the victims had lived, the focus shifted. Local papers printed photographs of Henry Roberts, Edward Carthy, Keith Randalls, and Tony Davies. Each image was a quiet act of defiance, a refusal to let the killer's mythology eclipse the lives he had taken. Quite rightly.
Very much so. For police, the case became a turning point. It showed how serial violence could hide in plain sight, scattered across distance and jurisdiction. At first, the murders appeared unconnected, different victims, settings, and counties. Only through persistence, plotting maps, comparing methods, sharing intelligence, did the pattern emerge. The coordination across regional lines became a model for later investigations. The case demonstrated that serial crime often revealed itself not through a single breakthrough, but through the slow accumulation of ordinary details.
In later years, senior officers acknowledged how the case had exposed both the strengths and limits of mid-1990s policing. There was no CCTV network linking towns, no digital database for matching statements, and DNA technology was still rudimentary. The investigation deepened on groundwork, door-to-door inquiries, public appeals, and witness recollections. The eventual connection between 4 deaths owed as much to persistence as to science.
Well, that lesson endured. In the years after, North Wales Police placed greater emphasis on cross-division communication and intelligence sharing, lessons reinforced in later homicide briefings. The Moore inquiry became required reading in briefings on serial offences, an example of methodical work confronting an offender who hid behind routine and familiarity.
For the families, the aftermath was quieter but far more personal. One of Tony Davies' relatives told reporters that Christmas never felt the same again, a simple truth that carried its own weight. His murder had come a week before the holiday, freezing the season in memory. Henry Roberts' relatives spoke of disbelief that a man who had lived so gentle could die with such violence. Others echoed the same sentiment. Remembrance must belong to the victims, not to the man who stole their lives.
Yeah, I definitely think more emphasis and remembrance should be solely on the victims. Peter Moore remains in custody, serving his whole life sentence with no prospect of release. He has never expressed remorse. For many, that absence of reflection confirmed what the trial had already shown, that his fascination with power and fear had always been about control, not conscience.
His case endures less for its spectacle than for what it revealed about vulnerability and trust. The spaces he invaded, a cottage, a forest, a caravan, and a beach, were ordinary until he entered them. In the end, communities across North Wales reclaimed those places not through fear, but through remembrance. The lasting legacy is not his self-styled horror, but the ordinary lives his violence interrupted. 4 men remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived.
Well, that was the man in black, Peter Moore.
Crazy. It makes me think of like trucker serial killers and stuff. You know, because they're transient. They travel. You could be in one place and then kill somebody, and then you're 700 miles away in another place, like in
Exactly,
America.
and trying to, link cases that are that far apart it's difficult, absolutely difficult for them to do. I would have thought, but by luck, they actually can do it. We've seen cases many cases where they found.
Yeah. They've connected them together and be like, okay, this is this, and here's the same MO. Yeah, it's persistent police work. They did a lot of hard work to catch him. So
yeah, I definitely think, also emphasis on the fact that going forward, any cases that you listen to from us, from anywhere else, is always remember the victims, give them your thoughts more than these horrific murderers.
So, first little announcement, we have a couple of special episodes coming out soon in the next couple of weeks.
It'll be exciting.
So we've got a couple extra special ones coming out. And so please stay tuned. And also, please give us a like, a comment, and 5-star ratings, reviews. They really, really help. You have no idea that it really, really helps with the algorithm and pushing us up and helping us out.
Getting more people to know of us.
Yeah. If you like what you hear, please do it. Okay, now I'm getting into the begging. So, but anyways.
Stop begging.
Yeah. So find us at Murder Most British on Instagram and TikTok, and MMB Podcast on Facebook. And I've also, it's a bit early, but we are putting together a Patreon. So whenever we're getting that ready to launch, and then also merchandise and that as well. So it's a little ways off.
It's in the pipeline, but yeah. Keep your ears and eyes peeled for that. We also have a link tree for everywhere that you can follow us down below. So until next week, stay safe and stay curious. And thanks for listening.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Take care, guys.
Bye.